Hello, I am back again to read you chapter 3, The Duchess of Gloucester. And this is chapter 3 out of 29 chapters. They're short chapters. In this chapter, she talks about primarily her time at Boughton House. It's one of her many homes that she would rotate through when she was a young child. And I am going to share on the screen a copy of the house. So you can see there, that would be a very, very cool house to visit. Actually, I might have to put that on my list of homes to see. So she does come from a family that, apparently I read she is the Charles II. She descends from Charles II's firstborn illegitimate child, James of Monmouth, and he was given a heritage, a dukedom from Charles II, and she descends from that family. But this castle is huge. Like, look at it. I mean, I have copies in the book of pictures of the homes that she used to rotate through as a child, and I think I'm going to make a little video of them in some of her childhood photos and put them on my channel and post them for everybody to see. But this is huge. This ranks right up there with Chatsworth House and all the other royal ancestry homes. But I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 3. December found us on the move again, this time to Dalkeith House, on the outskirts of the town Dalkeith, near Edinburgh. Here the whole family used to assemble annually for Christmas and New Year's. So it was Dalkeith that I celebrated all the Christmas Day birthdays of my childhood. The house, except for an estate office, was closed on the death of my grandfather in 1914 and has never been occupied by any member of the family since that date. Its treasures were eventually distributed among the other Buccleuch homes, and its rooms let out as offices and flats. Dalkeith, like Drumlanrig, was originally a Douglas stronghold. It had changed hands several times in the course of its history, including a period in the 15th century when it acted as a notorious lion's den of the Regent Morton. So its stones, though partially reorganized to form an 18th century mansion, had witnessed plenty of dark and bloody deeds over the years. The property was bought by the Buccleuchs in the middle of the 17th century, a troublesome enough period in itself. George Monk used the house as his headquarters in Scotland during the Commonwealth, and it is said to have planned the restoration of Charles II from here. The latter, on regaining the throne, married his eldest son, James, Duke of Monmouth, to the Countess Anna Buccleuch. Monmouth was also declared the first Duke of Buccleuch, but the title of Duchess was conferred on Anna in her own right 3 years later, thus saving her title and her lands from being attainted when Monmouth was later disgraced and executed for rebelling against his uncle James II. The eldest son of Monmouth and Duchess Anna did not outlive his mother, so it was the grandson of the marriage who became the second duke. Perhaps it was a murky happening in the distant past of the house that accounted for the spooky spot between the double doors leading into the upstairs drawing room. Sybil and I had to pass there on the way to our mother's sitting room, and always found it an ordeal. We used to hold hands. We'd shut our eyes and run through it as fast as possible. Many years later, one of my uncles told me that he had felt the same. That was not the only frightening aspect of the place. Some of the walls were very deep, and the lavatory we used was set into one of these. It was dark and eerie, with one small window for light, and it was very high up. We dreaded the door being closed, the possibility of getting locked in. One of the bedrooms had a brass plate on the door inscribed with the name General Monk. And after the war, when the old cellars were cleared out, 18 venerable bottles were discovered with the label proclaiming them to be General Monk's Amante, Amontillado. Roland, the steward, reported his discovery to my father, whose only progress was, no wine ever existed. Our journey to Dalkeith was by special train, hired to convey the family servants, carriages, horses, ponies, and a vast amount of luggage from Drumranlig. The Hamptons and other cousins would arrive in due course to swell the numbers. The house was referred to as the Palace by the local townspeople and contained a great many large rooms with high ceilinged carved doors. The little entrance hall was dominated by a huge painting of a Moorish giant. We lived in dread of him coming suddenly to life. Beyond lay a long, friendlier hall with a large table running down the middle, covered in tweed coats and capes, mackintoshes, hats, sticks, umbrellas, and more often than not, with one of two patient Labradors sprawled underneath. Against one wall stood a splendid weighing machine with a comfortable green leather seat and a place on which to put an array of weights ranging from the 4 stone down to the odd ounce. It was a house rule that every guest be weighed when they left, and the result written in the visitor's book. Usually factitious comments followed the entries, like after lunch or go easy on the pudding next time. Unfortunate guests of the booklooks had to undergo the same torture at Bow Hill, the family's residence in the Borders, house that was later to fulfill the Christmas role of Dalkeith. We loved using the machine, going up and down till the correct number of weights was placed on the opposite side. The hall was where we congregated for church, the private chapel at Dalkeith being in the park and also serving in the town's Episcopalian church. When at Ball Hall or Langholm, we sometimes used to attend the kirk. So as to offset this preference and show there was no ill feeling, my mother always professed to be religious, but not my father. He attended on Sundays because he felt he ought to, but wound his watch threatening if the sermon was taking too long. We would complete the poor clergyman's discomfort by running our dormice along the pews. Religion was by no means forced down our throats. In fact, it was Sybil who taught me the Lord's Prayer. This was when I was about 4. Up until then, I could only recite Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, which I did not like at all. Pity my simplicity. In particular, I found nonsensical and hard to say learning the Lord's Prayer came as a great relief. It seemed a very grown up thing to be able to do. With no electricity, and the only light was from candles, the odd gas lamp, and fires, which of course were almost like the sole source of heat. In the night nursery, we used to go up to bed with a raging log fire, and I loved watching the flickering light of the flames on the walls and ceilings. I shared the room with Sybil and a nursery maid. One evening I woke to whispers, and peeping over the sheet was much intrigued to see the nursery maid drying the footman's hair at the fireside. Footmen powdered their hair before waiting at dinner and were expected to have every trace of it brushed or washed out by the time they reported for duty the following morning. I suspected there was not any hot water, nor a warm fire to dry by the footmen's quarters or our nursery maid's friends, who are luckier than the others. though no doubt he would have got in a lot of trouble if he had been caught. Powder was an economy, wigs being expensive and reserved only for coachmen. Up in the attic were several enormous trunks full of old clothes, uniforms, crinolines, men's silk embroidered waistcoats, and satin pages suits of pink and pale, blue, and a wide variety of sizes. The suits had most the suits had most probably been made for coronations, but in common with many of the clothes may have been much older. There were also a lot of smelly old wigs. The clothes stank no less pungently of mothballs, but we loved dressing up in them. The grown-ups used them as well, donning them every year for a grand Christmas fancy dress dinner. This traditionally followed a fancy dress tea for the children. In later years, the custom was carried on at Bow Hill. It was there that our cousin, Miss Lucy Hope, once appeared as a geisha girl. She was a formidable, middle-aged lady with a pronounced mustache. To everyone's horror, and to everyone's horror, Billy, the self-appointed master of ceremony, announced that she'd won the first prize for coming as an Afghan chief. When I was 5 or 6, I was particularly devoted to my cousin David Brand, later Lord Hampton. One day, Billy took us aside. "If you go up the summer house in the old wood, you'll find a fairy there who'll marry you and let you live happily ever after on Scotch broth and chocolate meringues," he confided earnestly. The wood was the remains of the old Caledonian forest and of ancient oak trees. A fairy tale place for all of us children. And at its center stood an attractive Victorian summer house. Its walls were lined with a layer of dry heather and an intricate pattern of fir cones and nuts. David and I followed Billy's instructions, and after a prolonged vigil in the hut, during which no fairy appeared, became both disillusioned and frightened. Meanwhile, the alarm had been raised. Frantic nannies chased everywhere. The river bank was scoured. Eventually, Billy was asked where he had last seen us, and following his disclosures, we were rescued. At one point, the river bank was riddled with an eccentric assortment of artificial caves made in the Victorian times, one of them longer than the other and darker in the center. Here we played horrific games of pirates. Beetlejuice was the head of the pirates and also a hideout in the house, a small dark room at the bottom of the winding stairs where the footman cleaned the lamps. Before I was old enough to be enlisted as a pirate, I was allowed to go and visit this awesome figure. Escorted by Sybil, it was quite a while before I discovered that the dreaded Beetlejuice was Billy. There were plenty of other amusements. In a wide passage on the first floor was a huge gray rocking horse belonging to previous generations of young Scots. 3 of us could fit on its back and one on each of its rockers. Nearby, there was a very special grandfather clock. When it struck the hour, a row of little soldiers marched past just below the face. The clock is now on public display at Bow Hill. So is another curiosity for Dalkeith, a large glass case containing a musical box in which, as the turn of the handle, 3 monkeys in 18th century dress do conjuring tricks on a table with some dice. Aunt Connie, to whom we were devoted, was a great organizer of games and treats. Before the estate Christmas party, she always produced a deep bowl filled with different colored fruit drops, and these we would scoop, stir energetically, and shovel into bags and baskets to hang on the Christmas tree. I always found it rather hard having my birthday on Christmas Day. but it certainly never lessened the excitement and sometimes even had compensations. It enabled me, for instance, to join Aunt Connie on the annual trip to the pantomime in Edinburgh. She referred to it in a letter to me written not long before she died. I often think of our pantomime parties from Dalkeith. Mr. Whitmore of the party, as he had charge of the tickets, but why did Canon Cook go also? Sure, a mostly unsuitable person for a pantomime. I always had a charge of the youngest allowed to go, and remember, you were allowed to go at an earlier age than others because of your Christmas birthday. I remember you soundly in my arms all the way home in the family bus, and you were quite heavy, but I did not mind, as I loved you very much. The family bus was a horse-drawn wagonette, sitting 5 people aside each other. The policies at Dalkeith stood between the north and the south Esk. Along the banks were well-kept gravel paths, where nannies were apt to take prams and children the day before a duck shoot. They were causing considerable annoyance to the guns, who found all the ducks had flown elsewhere by the appointment time. The head keeper was a splendid fellow called Mr. Chowler, who rode about wearing a square bowler hat. He was a great expert on the stock exchange, and visiting guns would buttonhole him throughout the day on the subject of their portfolios. Apparently, when he died, he left several £1,000s, a lot of money at the time. One of the most frequent guests from outside the family, and certainly one of our favorites, was my grandfather's friend, Lord Rosebery, the former Prime Minister and last holder of that office to own a winner of the Derby. He enjoyed joking and teasing with us children, and Mary called him Lord Strawberry because of his red nose. In her day, Queen Victoria often stayed at Dalkeith, preferring it to Holyrood when she visited Edinburgh. In 1911, my youngest brother George was born in the house just before a visit by King George and Queen Mary. My mother asked the Queen if she would honor the baby by being a godmother, to which she said she would be delighted, but she forgot to mention it to the King. The following day, the King said to my father that he would like to be the baby's godfather. My father and mother did not dare mention about Queen Mary and gratefully accepted. The festivities at Dalkeith were over, and we once again boarded a hired train, just like a circus on the move, and headed for Boughton, at the heart of the Scott country in the Borders. The estate lies within the boundaries of the ancient Ettrick Forest, at one time the favorite hunting grounds of the kings of Scotland. Various Scots were rangers there in the Middle Ages, according to the legend. It was the courage of certain young Scots when saving the king's hounds from ferocious buck deep in Forest Cleuch, or a ravine, that earned the family their titular name of Buccleuch. No part of the 18th century building is visible today, the house having been rebuilt and successfully added during the first half of the 19th century. The new Bow Hill was the house most associated with Sir Walter Scott. Scott was a kinsman of the family, befriended at an early stage of his career by the third Duke, and in his prime by the fourth. Writing in old age of the young fifth Duke, he observed that I would not have him quite so soft-natured as his grandfather, whose kindness sometimes mastered his excellent understanding. His father had a temper which better jumped with my humor. Enough of ill nature to keep your good nature from being abused is no bad ingredient in their disposition who have favors to bestow. The fifth Duke proved the match of any that had preceded him. He was a distinguished public servant and a generous private benefactor who was acknowledged as one of the most enlightened and successful landowners of his time. It was this Duke's mother who gave Scott the idea for his first great literary success, The Lay of the Last Minstrel, and the poem was dedicated to his father, Duke Charles. The minstrel began his lay at Newark Castle, a ruin 2 miles north of the house, and in one stanza refers to the enchantments of Sweet Bowhill. This is an apt description, though the house is not beautiful or even particularly distinguished. It was always the happiest and most comfortable of our homes, and placed in a particularly beautiful situation between the fast-flowing rivers of Etterick and Yarrow. In the park and just visible from the windows are two lakes which frequently froze solid in winter, providing a chance for the young to play violent games of ice hockey, and the elderly the more restful sport of curling, their calls of soup, 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 echoing as they agitatedly brushed the ice, cleaning before the gliding stones. In time for Easter, the family would move south to pass the summer at Boughton in Northampshire. My grandfather handed over this property to my father early in the century, and here, as children, we stayed every year from Easter to middle of June, when we left our few weeks as guests of our grandparents at Montague House. Okay, so I'm just going to show you. This is a family picture of the family group of the young Alice when she was young. It's their family. They had a lot of brothers and sisters. They had Walter, Sybil. The mother was in the middle, Billy, and Mida, which was Margaret Ida. And in here, and I'm going to photo these and put them in a video. And I'm showing you Drumlingrad and Boughton. So if you can see that, I know you might not be able to see that, but I'll take pictures and I will put them in a video in case people want to see them. I think that's why I have this up here so people can see how grand these places are. And it sounds like a really fun and interesting childhood. In the descriptions of Dunlanrig, the family's autumn residence, it was the loveliest of all the Bucklock houses. And Boughton, the Northampshire, my parents' summer home, it was half a palace and half a village. So, Boughton, like the Montague House, was originally the property of the Montague family, and it became a portion of the Bucklock estates only when Duke Henry, the third Duke, married the Montague heiress in the middle of the 18th century. The architecture of the house documents the occupations and fortunes of its owners and in a remarkable way. From its origins as a monastery through the homely additions by the knightly Montagues of Elizabethan times, to the Versailles-like facade imposed by the first Duke at the end of the 17th century, and expressly designed to be fit for a king, he hoped it would tempt William and Mary to come and stay, and thus keep him as much in favor with the Protestant Orange Court as the Catholic Stuart one it had replaced. It is, in other words, not one building, but a hodgepodge of buildings. Its palatial front hiding a positive village of houses and courtyards of varying date, best revealed by the aerial view. It is best revealed by the aerial view. But it is Ralph, the first Duke, and John, the second, who have most left their mark. Ralph was in fact born only the second son, but his elder brother disgraced himself at Charles II's court by squeezing the Queen's hand, and Ralph took his place. In due course, he rose to a dukedom and the post of an ambassador at the court of Louis XIV, which experience led him, Louis XV, which experience led him to build this magnificent French chateau in the heart of the English country. The great north front and many of the treasures in the book collections are his legacy. The park is that of his son, John. The latter wanted to have an avenue of trees from Boughton to Old Montague House in Bloomsbury, but was unable to arrange this with the landowners en route. Instead, he planted his 70 miles worth of trees in avenues encircling and crisscrossing the estate. Between 1750 and 1900, the house was unused and therefore escaped change to an unusual degree. The only aspect to suffer was Duke John's elaborate system of canals, the lakes, and the fountains in the park. These have now been dug out and repaired at the instigation of my nephew, Johnny, who is the present Duke, so that the vistas, enlivened by the water effects, are now largely restored to their 18th century glory. Boughton always reminds me of cuckoos and the cawing of the rooks in the spring, and the summer days' warmth and peacefulness, with cotton frocks. Such things as woolen cardigans did not exist then, and wildflowers. There were bluebrills, fritillaries in profusion. We were allowed to roam at large. Nobody seemed to worry that we might drown in a lily pond or a river running through the park. We loved the birds and chasing the butterflies. We loved Boughton. I could see why. But because it was English, we could never admit to it. 4 villages stand at the edge of the park, each a mile or so distant from the house, and on Sundays, their intermingling church bells made a lovely sound. From each of them, on May the 1st, would come in turn separate groups of children. The girls landed, and the boys holding bunches of spring flowers as they carried their May Queen on a throne smothered in blooms and leafy branches. After singing songs, they would dance around the maypole, and then, to the delight of all, we showered them with well-polished pennies, thrown as far as possible to cause the greatest chase and scramble. When it was too wet to be outdoors, we took ourselves off to the top floor of the house, where endless unoccupied attics were perfect to hide in. Hardly anyone had been up there for 150 years, and in one room there was a very large and ancient billiard table, revered today as one of the oldest in England, upon which we played many exciting games of our own invention. It was a dusty and mysterious place, and we were forever alert to the possible excitements of meeting the mad Montague Duchess, who, it was said, had been locked up in one of the rooms from generations before. She, so the story went, had been a lady of great wealth and equal eccentricity, who had declared that the only man she could possibly marry was the Emperor of China. The cunning Duke of Montague, therefore, dressed up as the Emperor when he went to ask for her hand in marriage, which of course she bestowed with glee. Then, as soon as the marriage was completed and her wealth was his, he locked her up in the attic. The The paneled attic walls were painted a pale gray and were full of mice and bats. Bats were a great feature of Boughton. Once in our absence, some strange noises in my father's sitting room were investigated, and as a result, 300 dead bats were removed from behind a strip of paneling. Our nursery was a long gallery with a large carved wooden fireplace in the center of one wall. And our schoolroom was a beautiful library of leather-bound books and oak paneling. Most of the rooms in the house were hung with tapestries. One of the Dukes of Montague having owned the Moor Lake factory, to children these could be very frightening, and they depicted classical scenes with gruesome animals or violent episodes from the Bible. In a drought, they would move gently, which would be alarming in the twilight, and they filled the whole building with a mysterious peppery odor. Not long ago, some rather naughty drawings and remarks were discovered chalked on the wall behind a tapestry in one of the bedrooms. They were the work, apparently, of Sybil and me as children. Well, I guess if you are a child living in a place like that, you might try that. The house was cluttered with treasures, but we were never told to be careful of them or anything like that. They were just taken for granted. No curator cared for them. No parties of connoisseurs came to visit. And my parents were basically uninterested in these possessions. My father, it is true, much concerned himself with the pictures, but only in a sense that he liked to see them arranged strictly in accordance with their size. He spent hours with his valet, rehanging the collection, but when it came to furniture, preferred to sit in the comfort of an old garden wicker chair to anything more elegant. As for the sculpture, he and my uncle spent much of their youth trying to knock the noses off the statues of their Montague ancestors with cricket balls. The statues stood along a colonnade by the front door, high off the ground, so hitting them accurately was quite a test. Nevertheless, every nose had gone by the time I arrived. In a distant part of the house lived my great-aunt Ada. She was a widow of Admiral Lord Charles Scott, who was the captain of the ship in which my father had served as midshipman. She was a splendid old lady, greatly loved by us all, particularly by my mother. One of her sons, who was a land agent, lived with her. She had a unique distinction of owning a motorbike with a wicker sidecar, and as a special treat would sometimes allow Sybil, then about 13, to ride it, and me, age 11, to accompany her as the passenger. He and his brother, Sir David Scott, now in his 96th year, who had lives there, flew hawks, which they kept on hoops in the lawn. The hawks had to be fed on live mice and were frequently released to catch little birds. We thought it was very cruel, but dearly loved these grown-up cousins nonetheless. Another of our favorites was Great-Aunt Ada's niece, May Ryan, who occasionally appeared from Australia. Her future husband was to become Lord Casey, Governor of Bengal, and later Governor General of Australia. She was always inspired and entertaining, and today, at the age of 90, still flies her own airplane. Oh my gosh. Can you imagine 90 years old flying an airplane? And she was a female. See? In the summer of 1914, found my eldest sister, Meta, grown up, Walter, Lord Winchester, at Oxford, and Billy at Sandhurst. At Montague House, there was dinner parties for the young and meet us coming out ball. Sybil and I would leave our beds and peer out of the windows to watch the assembled guests sitting or walking about on the terrace below. Occasionally, we would shout a rude remark to some special friends or drop a message or a vulgar drawing. Now and again, Walter arrived in the schoolroom with a party of Oxford friends, pillow fights and much teasing and ragging being the inevitable result. More often than not, he would be accompanied by Bobbity Cranborne, the late Lord Salisbury. Mike and Rose Bowes Lyon, brother and elder sister of Queen Mother, Prince Paul of Serbia, and a young German, Count von Bieberstein. The schoolroom would be left in chaos. Our governess, few of whom lasted more than a year, not surprisingly, having tactfully withdrawn, and World War I was about to break out, irrevocably changing the lives of us all. My grandfather outlived my grandmother by 2 years and died in the first autumn of the war. He was buried at Dalkeith. When we heard we were going to the funeral, and we felt grand and grown up, but we were also terrified that we might see his corpse. And on this we were spared. But on that day, I was no less horrified by the sight of the coffin being lowered into the vault. I did not think children should be made to attend funerals. Afterwards, a period of mourning was observed during which we were all plunged into the black, even to the buttons of the footman's livery. And that is the end of chapter 4. So you can see the life she had, the places she lived at, and, it just all gives you that Downton Abbey feel, and this was right before World War I. And then, I think the lives of these dukes and, the present generation dukes, like, look at this Boughton House. All of them have inherited these homes, these ducal homes and aristocratic homes, and they open them up to the public now. And, people can now see them and appreciate them. But I can see where they're there's so much history in them, and there's quite a bit to see, that I could see why they open them up to the public, because it is quite a expense. So I will go ahead and end this, and I will do chapter 4.